If blind drawing provides you with the opportunity to really look and concentrate on the figure, to notice every crease, fold, change of contour, change of line direction, etc., to slow your looking down, to pay particular attention to the individuality and peculiarity of every aspect of the figure, the results usually can be quite startling in terms of the quality of noticing the figure. You may compare an initial drawing that you made prior to any instruction with a blind drawing, and you may notice in most students' drawings considerably improved observational skills. Of course, not looking at the paper will provide its own problems. One, there is a tendency to look at your drawing, and often that results in some laughter because the lines don't quite meet. Proportions can be wrong. Lines can stray off in all sorts of different directions. That's not really the point. The point of blind drawing is to get you into a way of looking that you can then build upon. So if blind drawing provides you with the opportunity to train your eye to learn how to see, how do you get the lines to be in the right place? Well, the answer is really, really simple. It's you just need to look a little bit. One of the key things to think about for the moment is the relationship between looking at the subject and looking at the figure. A couple of days ago, I was teaching a life drawing class and I looked at the students making some drawings from the figure. And as they were looking at the figure and glancing down at their page, I counted the amount of time they were looking and they were drawing. On average, most students were spending about 5 seconds looking at their sketchbook page and about 1 second looking at the figure. It would be quite obvious then, if you think about that idea, that if you would find it difficult to draw a parent from memory with over a couple of million minutes worth of experience, how can you draw a figure from memory when you've only seen it for maybe 5 minutes completely? Again, if you're looking at the relationship between, 1 second looking at the figure, 5 seconds looking at the paper, with a 5-minute pose, you'd only actually be looking at the figure in total for a minute. So the key thing to think about then is reversing that, to spend longer looking at the figure and much, much less time looking at your paper. And that brings us to what Betty Edwards calls a partial peak drawing. So you are partially peeking at your sketchbook page, but certainly not partially peeking at the figure. Your eye should move in exactly that same way that it moved for blind drawing. You should visualize yourself to be an ant, crawling ever so slowly over the surface of the creases and folds of the clothing or the changes of contour on the figure, looking for the opportunity wherever possible to circumnavigate your way around the limbs so that you're not asserting your understanding of what a limb looks like. You're moving backwards and forwards over the changes of contour, over the creases and folds, so that you're much more acutely attuned to the idea of drawing shapes rather than the objects. Remembering that the important aspect of this is to think that if you draw and look in the right way, your observations will improve. So in this partial peak drawing, worked in this instance from a fashion illustration in a magazine, the key objective is not to rush to the end as quickly as possible, but to become absolutely engrossed in the toing and froing of the line. One of the things that I've talked about a number of times in my sessions is the idea of the way that you draw that line as well. Many of you will have a habit of drawing a furry line, a sketchy line, roughing in the edges of the contour. It's my belief that when you draw in that way, in this particular exercise, you lose contact with what it is you're trying to draw. You lose contact with that edge change, that contour line, that change of subtle direction. Instead, you make approximations. And it's the approximations, the ironing out of the creases, that means that your drawing takes on a more generic quality of a figure rather than the exactitude of the figure in front of you. So, working through the fashion illustration, working through the changes of direction, trying to get lost in the creases and folds, trying to find your way from one point to another point, Again, rather like that taxi driver navigating the longest possible distance backwards and forwards around the streets, not moving directly from A to B, but circumnavigating around various different changes of direction. I've sometimes talked about the idea of jumping ship as well. If you find yourself working on a particular limb, particularly a limb in isolation, you can get lost in it and lose sight of its proportion against the other aspects of the drawing. So it's important to almost work your way across the figure. It might sometimes be useful to work from one wrist to the other wrist, from one elbow to the other elbow, working backwards and forwards across the figure so that you're travelling a more unfamiliar terrain. You can, of course, as well find that if you start with a head and work your way through an arm and through a leg, then you can draw a head against itself in terms of its own scale, and you then not able to see the proportion of that head in relationship to the proportion of the body. Again, using some of these strategies to work backwards and forwards across the figure, to leave the face certainly to the last possible moment so that you discover the space left for the face rather than start with the face, because when you draw a face on its own, it's that point where you are much more likely to draw your perception of what faces look like, to revert back to that schemata that you may have used when you drew your parent. So the task of partial peak drawing is really there to improve your observational skills. It is advantageous to use a medium like pen or biro or fine liner, which is one that you can't rub out. It doesn't matter if the line that you put down is in the wrong place. Simply draw another one. Your brain is a very, very forgiving instrument, and when confronted with a number of lines, it will pick out the right line and will ignore the wrong lines. Trust yourself, trust in the process, trust in the idea that if you use this strategy in shortish poses, your observational skills will improve tremendously.